are listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards. Hello, and welcome to this April 9th edition of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards, and our guest today is back by popular demand. We talked to him when this podcast started back in August, and now he's back because it's baseball season again. Negro Leagues Baseball Museum President Bob Kendrick joins us today. Mr. Kendrick, welcome back to the Stories from Real Life podcast.
Oh, Melvin, man, it's great to be back. I feel honored that I got invited back, so I hope that means I said something that made some sense the last time that we were together.
Yes, I think people wanted to hear you more than I know they wanted to hear you more than they wanted to hear me, but you have to go through me. So we're back. We're both back. But thank you for being here today.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
So it looks like you had a busy off season preparing for the 2024 season there at the museum. What are some of your favorite parts of starting a new baseball season, especially at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum?
Well, number one, for all of us who are baseball fans, the beginning of a new season, hope springs eternal. For all 30 major league teams, we all think we got a shot. And honestly, I think that my young Kansas City Royals have a legitimate shot to make some noise in the Central Division. I love some of the things that we've done to address some roster needs, particularly along the line of the pitching. I think our starting pitching rotation has gotten much better. Hopefully the bullpen will be able to hold up during the course of the season. But the first series that we saw with the Twins to open the season, the starting pitching was outstanding. The bats were a little bit chilly, but the bats picked up, and so we're all excited about that. And with this being the 100th anniversary of the inaugural Negro League World Series, we've got a lot of fun things that are going on in and around the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum as baseball season is once again upon us, and we get to try and connect the dots in as best as we can and try and generate excitement and energy around the significance of that initial World Series 100 years ago in 1924, and locally the fact that our Kansas City Monarchs would win that inaugural Negro League World Series, becoming Kansas City's first major professional sports team champion of any kind in 1924. And Melvin, for a city that hangs its hat on its championship pedigree, it all originated with the Kansas City Monarchs. And as I've oftentimes said, no professional sports franchise in Kansas City won at the level that the Kansas City Monarchs did. And so this gives us an opportunity to educate, find creative, innovative ways to try and raise money for the museum. And so I'm looking forward to what I hope is a tremendously successful baseball season all across the board.
That sounds great. You actually touched on a couple of my follow-up questions to that. First of all, you talked about raising money, and I saw on your website that J.E. Dunn Construction is doing something special. So let's give them a shout out. So tell the listeners what they're doing to support the museum.
Well, I'm really excited about this because for every run that the Royals score, J.E. Dunn, a national construction company that is headquartered here in Kansas City, they too are celebrating their 100th anniversary. They're going to donate $100 to the museum for every run the Royals score during the regular season.
Nice.
And man, Melvin, I sure hope they score a bunch of runs, man. Typically, I'm that old school guy. I love a good pitching duel. 1-0, 2-1 ball game. Not this year. No, I want to see more of those games like we had on the finale of our 3-game series with the Twins, where we won that game 11-0. Yeah, no, that's the kind of games that I want to see this year. But no, it's a fun way to remind people of the significance of the 100th anniversary, the significance of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and for us to align our brand with a very well-established national brand as J.E. Dunn is something that we are tremendously proud of. I hope fans will get behind this and also enjoy what we're doing. What a great way every game to talk about what this means for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And when you operate in that nonprofit spectrum, you try to find any stream of revenue that you possibly can. And this will be a fun, exciting way to raise some proceeds for the museum, but also help continue to raise the profile and awareness of our great museum.
Well, make sure you get the word to the Kansas City batters so that they don't leave runners at third base. All right. So, what kind of celebrations do you have planned to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Kansas City Monarchs?
Well, we've got a lot of things that we're rolling out during the course of the year. We had the big announcement back in February to officially commemorate that milestone occasion. You, that first Negro Leagues World Series, in many ways, Melvin, was a validating point for the Negro Leagues to help Major League Baseball understand that they had someone that they had to reckon with. Because when you set up this World Series, now you are doing exactly what Major League Baseball was doing. And the games were played right in and around the same time. So, in some ways, it was validating for the Negro League. So, when Rube Foster formed the Negro League, he formed the Negro National League in 1920 here in Kansas City. In 1923, a guy by the name of Ed Bolden would form a rival league known as the Eastern Colored League. They didn't have a World Series that very first year because, to be candid, Rube Foster was not necessarily filling Ed Bolden and this rival league, because through Ed Bolden, white businessmen who saw that there was money to be made in black baseball got into black baseball in a more deeper capacity. Rube didn't like that. Rube was really trying to keep the Negro Leagues as black as he could keep it. He only had allowed James Leslie Wilkinson into his Negro National League. Wilkie, of course, owned the great Kansas City Monarchs. Rube wasn't necessarily for Wilkinson's involvement initially, but Rube, being the savvy businessman that he was, number one, he kept hearing these great things about this dude named James Leslie Wilkinson, who Buck O'Neill would say was the first white man he ever met without any prejudice. Said if there weren't enough hotel rooms to go around, he and Wilkie slept in the same bed together. So Wilkinson was a 2,000 man in the 1900s.
Wow.
And then Wilkie had what Rube needed, and that was access to stadiums. So if his newly formed Negro Leagues were going to succeed, he needed that access to stadiums, because most of the black owners of those Negro League teams, they didn't have their own stadiums. There were only a handful of Negro League owners that would eventually own their own stadiums. And for me, that was the biggest thing that separated the Negro Leagues from the major leagues, was resources. Yeah, the major league owners had complete access to their stadiums, which is one of the reasons that it took so long to integrate the game, because the Negro Leagues were renting those ballparks from their major league counterparts. And in many of these instances, they were outdrawing the major league team that occupied those stadiums. But those major league teams were getting a percentage of the gate and likely all of the concession. So there were a number of major league teams were in no hurry to see integration because they knew they would lose a source of revenue. And so Rube relented. Wilkie comes in, brings his charter Kansas City Monarchs into the Negro Leagues. Of course, the Monarchs will become one of the greatest baseball franchises, not in black baseball history, but in baseball history. Man, one losing season in their almost 40-year existence in the Negro Leagues sent more players to the major leagues than any other Negro League franchise. They were a model organization. Melvin, there are those who will say that the Kansas City Monarchs were the New York Yankees of the Negro Leagues. But man, there are others who will say that the New York Yankees were the Kansas City Monarchs of Major League Baseball. They were that good. And so Wilkie comes in, and then in 23, Ed Bolden forms his league. 24, he and Rube were able to kind of mend their fences, and they have this first World Series, our Kansas City Monarchs against the Hilldale Club, a.k.a. the Hilldale Daisies, out of Darby, Pennsylvania. And as I mentioned, the Monarchs would win that inaugural World Series. So when we made this announcement in February of this year, we wanted to commemorate the national milestone itself and then start this year-long celebration here in Kansas City to tout really the most preeminent winning franchise in Kansas City sports history. So we've put together partnerships with various major Kansas City brands. Many of them are national brands. They're just headquartered in Kansas City. So we started off for you guys who are bourbon whiskey drinkers with this really cool limited edition whiskey set that is done with a distillery called J. Rieger here in Kansas City. Beautiful tribute to not only the Kansas City Monarchs, St. Louis Stars, Chicago American Giants, and the Homestead Grays. So it's a combination of bourbon and other spirits in this limited edition set, with portion of the proceeds coming back to benefit the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. You'll see a number of our other great and fun promotions, including the J.E. Dunn promotion that we just talked about. Topsy's Popcorn, which is headquartered here in Kansas City, is a national brand. You expect to see a commemorative 1924 Kansas City Monarch popcorn tin, coming later
Nice.
on in the year. Russell Stover's Candy, also based, headquartered here in Kansas City. We're working on a limited edition tribute to the Kansas City Monarchs with them. Boulevard Brewing Company, who we've done some incredible partnerships with in the past. Another limited edition ale that is coming to salute the Kansas City Monarchs. And then we will host several events that fall under the umbrella of our 100th anniversary celebration. May 11th, it is Jazz and Jackie, a musical salute to Jackie Robinson, whose career began, of course, in 1945 with the Kansas City Monarchs. And of course, we have the incomparable Layla Hathaway in concert to salute Jackie Robinson here, right across the street from the museum at the Gym Theater. We have a hot dog festival, annual Heart of America Hot Dog Festival, a celebration of baseball and hot dogs that I'm expecting nearly 10,000 people to be here for that festival in August. And then we will end the year with what I call the Monarchs Ball. And the Monarchs Ball, which I am really looking forward to, will be a celebration of the black and brown professional baseball stars of Kansas City. So this will go back to the Kansas City A's through the Kansas City Royals and have a reunion of those great black and brown professional baseball players who call Kansas City home. Because if you go back and look at that 1924 Negro League World Series, a Cuban by the name of Jose Mendez was the manager of that Kansas City Monarch team. Yeah, El Negro, the Black Diamond. Yeah, Jose Mendez, folks, is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. So this whole kind of symbiotic bond between black and brown was so prevalent in the Negro Leagues. And it's been a main part of Kansas City's rich baseball history as well. And so to salute the Monarchs, I thought it would be fun to bring back those surviving black and brown players of Kansas City baseball, professional baseball past.
Okay. So how many Hall of Famers played or managed to coach for the Monarchs?
Oh man, it's almost too many to count. But when I look at the 1924 team, Wilbur Bullet Rogan. Bullet Rogan was the first, I would say, of two superstars of the Negro Leagues. Now, you had a bunch of stars, but Bullet Rogan and Oscar Charleston, who was playing for the Indianapolis ABCs, were the Negro League's two first superstars. And what I love about this phenomenon by the name of Shohei Ohtani is that Melvin, he's given me an opportunity to tout the great two-way stars of the Negro Leagues. And they were plentiful. Bullet Rogan being the preeminent of those great two-way stars in the Negro Leagues. When Bullet Rogan had dominating stuff, great pitcher, in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, of course. And when he wasn't pitching, he hit cleanup and played the outfield. and in the vernacular of one Leroy Satchel Paige, in the way that only Satchel Paige could say it, Bullet Rogan is the onlyest ball player I ever saw that pitched and hit in the cleanup position. That's how good Bullet Rogan was. Bullet Rogan led the Negro Leagues in stolen bases, man, when he was 38 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, outstanding. But here's the thing. Shohei Ohtani is a very imposing figure. I was shocked at how big Shohei is. Bullet Rogan is on the other end of the spectrum. Bullet Rogan was probably 5'8", maybe 5'9",
Oh,
weighed about 170 pounds, looked a little pudgy, but he was a tremendous athlete. You didn't see athlete when you looked at him, but he was. And Melvin, he threw with a no wind-up delivery, and yet his nickname was Bullet. Yeah, he
wow.
could get it up there in a hurry, man. And so Bullet Rogan, Jose Mendez, who we mentioned was managing the team, was also pitching on that team. And when Jose Mendez was a youngster in Cuba, electric stuff. The Cincinnati Reds, who were the world champions at that time, came down to Cuba, and a young Jose Mendez just handled them, man. And
Wow.
Mendez would come here to play. Cristobal Torriente, one of my favorite names, another great Cuban player that's in the National Baseball Hall of Fame that played and starred for the Kansas City Monarchs. Hilton Lee Smith. Hilton Smith. And I say this, and it's not the right choice of words, but I oftentimes say he had the misfortune of being on the same team with Satchel Paige. Because when Satchel walked in the room lit up. You knew Satchel was in the room, and if you didn't know Satchel was in the room, Satchel was going to let you know that he was in the room. And Hilton Smith was the polar opposite. Quiet, workmanlike, but man, just as lethal. Buck O'Neill says the greatest curveball he ever saw. My dear friend, the late great Monty Irvin, Hall of Famer, says that you could know Hilton Smith curveball was coming, and the break on it was so sharp, you still couldn't hit it. And same thing, Melvin, when he wasn't pitching, he played the outfield, lifetime batting average over 300. He won the Triple Crown one year in the Negro Leagues. I mean, just an incredible pitcher who finally got in the Hall of Fame some years ago. And then you talk about guys like Willard Brown, Willard Home Run Brown. And let me tell y'all, if Josh Gibson nicknamed you Home Run, you probably got some power. And Willard Brown was a tremendous outfielder for the Kansas City Monarchs who got a cup of coffee in the major leagues. The St. Louis Browns would sign Willard Brown and Hank Thompson in 1947, which surprises people. There were 5 guys who go up in 1947. We remember Jackie Robinson. A few more of us remember Larry Doby, even though he is late in getting the kind of love that he should have gotten for his pioneering role. But Hank Thompson, Willard Brown, and Dan Bankhead would all go up in 1947. Hank Thompson and Willard Brown left the Kansas City Monarchs to go to the St. Louis Browns. But the St. Louis Browns thought that Thompson and Brown would do for them what Jackie had done for Brooklyn. But the St. Louis Browns, Melvin, were a sideshow. Nobody cared about the St. Louis Browns. Both Hank Thompson and Willard Brown knew they had left a ball club that was far better in the Kansas City Monarchs than the St. Louis Browns. And both got unceremoniously released by the Browns. And Willard Brown would come back to rejoin the Kansas City Monarchs, would go over to Puerto Rico and spend a lot of time in Puerto Rico. And in Puerto Rico, his nickname, Ese Hombre, that man. The fans started chanting when he came to the plate. Ese hombre, ese hombre. And Willard Brown won the Triple Crown in Puerto Rico twice. His Winter League home run season is still he still holds the record for having hit the most home runs in a Puerto Rican Winter League season. The closest guy to get to him, Reggie Jackson.
Hmm.
And so Willard Brown was incredible. And then you started to talk about Hall of Famer Buck O'Neill, who finally got in the Hall of Fame 16 years after he passed away. And he goes in the Hall of Fame primarily for his role as an ambassador, but people forget how good Buck O'Neill was. Buck O'Neill was a dazzling first baseman for the Kansas City Monarchs. I mean, he could pick it with the best of them. Classic line drive hitter with some power and a clutch hitter. And even when he became a kind of player manager, he still would insert himself in the game in critical situations because I think Buck said, I trust me more than I trust some of you others. And then, of course, you start to think about the contemporaries, guys like Ernie Banks, who called the Kansas City Monarchs home, who would go on to become and break the color barrier with the Chicago Cubs. And Ernie plays here under the tutelage of Buck O'Neill. And so, yeah, the Monarchs have had, and we even talked about Jackie Robinson and Satchel Paige because they both were here. You know, while Jackie goes in the Hall of Fame for his major league career, we both know that his career started here in 1945. And had it not been for the Negro Leagues, we don't get Jackie Robinson. And of course, Leroy Satchel Paige. We don't have enough time to talk about the exploits of Leroy Satchel Paige. So you can see a litany of those great stars that called the Monarchs home. And there were a number of players, the Cool Papa Bells, Turkey Stearns. They all spent some time with the Monarchs, Willie Wells. These guys all in the Hall of Fame. They all played here in Kansas City at some point in time. So again, as much as I love my Kansas City Royals, they don't have that same legacy and history that we're talking about with the great Kansas City Monarchs.
Okay. Wow, that's really impressive. All right. So just recently, we lost Oscar-winning actor Louis Gossett Jr., who once played Satchel Paige in the
Yeah.
1981 movie "Don't Look Back." So I'm curious, what are your favorite baseball movies of all time?
My favorite one is Bingo Long, Traveling All Stars, and Motor Kings, and which is one of the great titles of all time.
The
And a
longest
lot of
title.
people may not, yeah, exactly. A lot of people may not have heard of that film. It's still available on wherever you stream, Netflix or these places that you stream. And I would encourage everybody, if you have not seen this film, check it out.
I agree.
It,
Billy,
it,
Billy
it,
D.
it
Williams and
Billy D. Williams, James
James Earl
Earl Jones,
Jones.
genius Richard Pryor, who were the stars of really what was an all-star African American cast in the 1970s. But here's the funny thing about it: the film is based on a fictional novel by the same title, and in the book, James Earl Jones' character is actually the pitcher, and but Billy D. Williams was just coming off the blockbuster film Lady Sings the Blues. And all the women were feeling Billy D. Williams. They fall in love with Billy D. Williams, good looking guy, smooth. And so when they casted Billy D. Williams to play in the film, you're not putting Billy D. Williams in a catcher's mask for three-quarters of the movie. So they switched the roles and made Billy D. Williams the pitcher, and they moved poor James Earl Jones behind the plate. And I guess they say, well, James, you got a great voice, but we women want to see Billy D. Williams, and they switched the roles around, and it's almost a cult-like film. And in any film that you got Richard Pryor in, you already know what that's going to be like, and it's loosely based on the Negro Leagues. Like I said, it was a fictional novel, but you could say that James Earl Jones' character mimicked Josh Gibson. Billy D. Williams' character was Richard Pryor. I mean, I'm sorry, it was Satchel Paige. And Richard Pryor's character was kind of a homogenous kind of combination of a bunch of people because he would do these crazy things, try to pass himself off by speaking a broken down Spanish and these kinds of things, and which is actually true. There were many instances in the Negro Leagues where the guys would indeed try to speak a broken down Spanish because it might enable them to get a meal where otherwise they wouldn't be able to get a meal. And of course, the irony of that is here were men and, of course, women who were as American as anyone, who were being treated as un-American as anyone, to the point that you would have to try and pass yourself off by being from another country to get basic services in this country. But of course, Richard Pryor added another element to that story, and the owner, the unscrupulous owner, was loosely based off of the owner Effa Manley, who was one of the women who owned a Negro Leagues franchise, and she is the one that is responsible, really, for Monty Irvin not being the first to break the color barrier. You see, Jackie Robinson was not Branch Rickey's first choice. His first choice was Monty Irvin, the great Monty Irvin. Monty Irvin was a five-tool superstar, as I like to say, man, with movie star good looks. Monty had everything. He had the same pedigree that Jackie had. Matter of fact, he had served in the military. He's college educated. And so Monty had just gotten back from World War II. Branch Rickey had already snuck and signed Monty Irvin. But Monty would admit that he was suffering from what he then called shell shock. Today, of course, we call it PTSD. But the real reason that Monty wasn't the first, it wasn't because of the shell shock. It was because of Effa Manley. Effa Manley, to say that she couldn't stand Branch Rickey would be an understatement.
Wow.
She didn't care for Branch Rickey. And honestly, rightfully so. She saw exactly what Branch Rickey was going to do. Branch Rickey was going to come into the Negro Leagues and essentially raid it of its star talent without any compensation to those Negro League owners. And so when she catches wind that he had signed Monty Irvin, she threatened to litigate. And Branch Rickey smartly backed off of Monty Irvin, because I think Rickey knew he didn't need this public battle with this black woman over this black player, because you already know the other owners are going to stand in solidarity and try and block this move anyway. So he backs off of Monty Irvin. That's when he turns his sight here to Kansas City, to one Jackie Roosevelt Robinson. And I tell people all the time, here's how shrewd and calculating I believe Rickey was. Rickey has been hailed as a saint. And Melvin, I'm sure there was some righteousness to Rickey, because it was still a tremendously bold move to go try and sign a black player and bring him into Major League Baseball, because you already knew you were going to be ostracized by your peers. But Rickey is somewhere between a saint and a devil. But then again, aren't we all? Uh-huh. And according to my late mother, I could be both in the same day.
That's funny.
Here's what I believe that Rickey was banking on. Rickey was banking on the fact that the Kansas City Monarchs owner, James Leslie Wilkinson, couldn't fight back. And you know why? Because he was white. He's a white man. Yeah. There's no way that this white man who made his entire living in black baseball can be the public face of trying to block essentially what every black person in America had been waiting for a black man to play in the major leagues. If he does, that loyal fan base, that fan base that has been so tremendously loyal to him, Melvin, they would have turned their backs on him right away. And Rickey was banking on this. So he had Wilkie stuck, as I like to say, between that proverbial rock and hard place. Yeah, so publicly, Wilkie said all the right things. Privately, man, he's seething. But he's not seething because a black player is about to play in the major leagues. This black man, you going to take away from me? You're going to put me out of business. And he was absolutely right. It was going to be a natural byproduct of what was going to happen when integration occurred. It wasn't going to be a matter of if the Negro Leagues were going to fold, but more so a matter of when the Negro Leagues were going to fold. And he bowed out gracefully in 1948, the year after Jackie takes the field with Brooklyn, because again, the handwriting is on the proverbial wall. Yeah, this is about to become a wrap. And so he got out of the business of black baseball while he could.
Okay. So this episode is going to air just a few days before the annual April 15th Jackie Robinson Day celebration in Major League Baseball. So
Uh-huh.
why is it important to keep Jackie's legacy alive?
Well, I think Jackie's enduring spirit is very much, number one, still alive. And it's important that we keep it alive. And baseball has done a wonderful job of helping people remember Jackie Robinson. The annual April 15th celebration has been one of the primary ways of keeping his legacy alive. There's a reason that there are more Jackie Robinson statues in this country than any other, certainly sports figure, and likely any other individual. It speaks to what he was able to endure as that barrier breaking pioneer. And I oftentimes tell people, whether you believe it or not, if you don't think that one individual can invoke change, you need to look no further than one Jackie Roosevelt Robinson. And so he should be remembered. And of course, for us, his remembrances are tied right back to the Negro Leagues and how important the Negro Leagues were. Because a lot of people don't realize that he played here in 1945 for the great Kansas City Monarchs. And I tell people all the time, he only spent 5 months in Kansas City. And the 5 months he spent in Kansas City, Melvin, he fell in love with everything Kansas City is famous for: barbecue and jazz. He liked the ribs at a place called Old Kentuck Barbecue. Old Kentuck Barbecue, for those who are familiar with Kansas City barbecue, which I'm biased, but it is the best barbecue on the face of the planet. Old Kentucky Barbecue was the forerunner of the great Gates barbecue chain of restaurants that are world renowned in Kansas City. And as I oftentimes say, I think he fell deeper in love with jazz because I'm sure he was already a jazz aficionado. But as I remind folks, while New Orleans may lay claim to jazz, Kansas City gave jazz its soul. And 5 months later, man, Jackie was gone. He was gone. And I was very blessed to know several of his Kansas City Monarch teammates. And if they were with us, they'd all tell you the same thing, that when Jackie joined the Monarchs in 1945, there was no fanfare around Jackie. Jackie was just another ball player trying to make the great Kansas City Monarchs roster. But they knew that he was different than they were. My friend Buck O'Neill would surmise it in this fashion: we had become acclimated to segregation, but not Jackie. Jackie was Pasadena, California. He's UCLA. This whole Jim Crow thing, man, didn't sit well with him whatsoever. But outside of that, that was it. And 5 months later, he had disappeared. I mean, his teammates had no idea where he was. Of course, we now know that he was meeting with Branch Rickey, where the two of them would make the monumental decision that Jackie would become the chosen one to break Major League Baseball's then 6 decade long self imposed color barrier. And as I've oftentimes touted here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, we make the bold assertion that Jackie's breaking of the color barrier wasn't just a part of the civil rights movement, it was the beginning of the civil rights movement. This is 1947. This is well before those more noted civil rights occurrences. So this is before Brown versus Board of Education. This is before Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as Buck O'Neill would so eloquently say, was merely a sophomore at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, when Jackie signed his contract to play in the Dodgers organization. And of course, our very own President Harry S. Truman, born right up the road from where the Negro League Baseball Museum operates, Independence, Missouri, would not integrate the armed forces until a year after Jackie. So for all intents and purposes, this is what started the ball of social progress rolling in our country, baseball. So Jackie's enduring legacy is still very prevalent. And of course, we know that there's still work to be done, particularly as we continue to try and bridge that racial divide that we're seeing grow even more so, seemingly, in our country.
So, as we've said, Jackie was the one to break the modern color barrier, which means he was obviously the first black player for the Dodgers. And the last team to integrate was the Boston Red Sox 12 years later. And
Yes,
that player's name was Pumpsy Green. This is going to seem like
Eli.
a joke. This is going to seem like a joke question, but it's a serious question. Why hasn't anyone ever considered officially renaming the wall in Fenway Park the Pumpsy Green Monster?
You know what? Actually, I think that's a really fun idea. I love these kinds of ideas and I love getting behind them because, in many ways, Mr. Green is the answer to a trivia question. Just as I mentioned earlier about the fact that there were five guys who go up in 1947, and very few folks knew that there were five to go up in 1947 because we only hear really about Jackie. Pumpsy Green, as you mentioned, would become the last player to integrate a major league team in 1959 with the Boston Red Sox. And to be honest, Boston had its pick of litter of star talent that they passed on because Boston really didn't want a black player. But by 1959, I think they were succumbing to the pressure that, wait a minute, everybody else got one. We better go get one. And they did. They went and signed Elijah Pumpsy Green, who was a good player, two-time All-Star, if I'm not mistaken. And it would be kind of fun to name the Green Monster for Pumpsy Green. Yeah, I love that idea.
Let's do it. Okay, again, we've talked about Jackie being the breaker of the modern color barrier because there was an earlier color barrier, and Bud Fowler was integrating baseball back in the 19th century. Why is it important for baseball fans to know who he is?
Well, Bud Fowler finally gets into the Hall of Fame in 2022. And here's the kind of cool thing about this is that he's the first player from Cooperstown, New York, to be inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. And Bud Fowler was an early innovator, integrator of white professional teams. They weren't necessarily considered major league teams at that time, but they were still white professional teams. And Bud Fowler was an outstanding player who I think eventually realized that the weight of his skin color was never going to allow him to stick and stay. No matter what teams he would go to, even though he was oftentimes the best player on those teams, he could never find a home with those teams because his blackness just weighed him down. And then Bud Fowler would eventually start promoting the game and, of course, was part of putting together that great barnstorming team called the Page Fence Giants, who won record numbers of games barnstorming across the country. But it was great to see Bud Fowler finally inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame for his integration role. And then you still have guys like, of course, Moses Fleetwood Walker, who has been widely recognized as the first known black to play on what would be considered a major league team. This goes back to the late 1800s, about 1883 or so. And we've since discovered that there was another ball player by the name of William Edward White, who played one game prior to Moses Fleetwood Walker. But here's the caveat. William Edward White didn't know he was black. William Edward White thought he was white. He identified as white. His father was white. It was later discovered that he was the byproduct of an affair that his father had with one of the slaves, thus making him black. But that's kind of it's been kind of a footnote in baseball history. But Moses Fleetwood Walker was of darker skin. There was no denying his ethnicity. And I remind folks that Moses Fleetwood Walker, y'all, was a barehanded catcher. Ouch. Uh-huh. And of course, his stay in baseball didn't last long either because guys like Adrian Cap Anson and others formed, quote unquote, a gentleman's agreement that would ban blacks from playing on white major league teams for the next 6 decades. Here's the thing. There was no written doctrine, just a verbalized agreement that basically said if you allow a black to play with you, you can't play with us. Well, a guy like Anson was so influential because he was an outstanding baseball player. He's in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. So, yeah, it was easy for him to build a coalition of followers who shared that same sentiment. And do you know the major league owners upheld that gentleman's agreement all the way until Jackie breaks the color barrier in 1947? And they were quick to tell you there's nothing written that says a black man can't play in the major leagues, but they were upholding that verbalized agreement. They would say stuff like, if we can find the right one. You got all this incredible talent, playing in many of your ballparks, and it was if we could find the right one. But of course, that player had to be of high moral character and educated and all these things that 90% of the major league players weren't in order to,
Yes.
to join them. And so if Kennesaw Mountain Landis doesn't die, who knows how long it would have been before the color barrier was essentially rebroken. Uh-huh.
Yeah, there was no coincidence that it was right after Commissioner Landis died that Branch Rickey
Absolutely.
brought in. But
Yeah.
you mentioned Adrian Cap Anson. I want to add another scoundrel to that little list. Um, Albert Goodwill Spalding, who
Yes.
was a pitcher, and then he left baseball at the height of his career to start the sporting goods company,
Yes.
which was Spalding like
Oh,
baseball gloves, and he was with Cap Anson, and he was part of that
yeah.
um,
You know,
force to keep baseball segregated.
well, and I honestly believe that fear drove this, perhaps even more than the social conditions of our time, because people like Anson, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who it's such a strange relationship that he had with Rube Foster, because he had great admiration and respect for Rube Foster. There's a quote in the museum that says that was derived from Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Says, "Mr. Foster, you give our league a black eye when your teams beat ours." So they knew these guys could play. Yeah, and so it was as much about job security as it was with the social conditions of our time.
Absolutely. All right. So just to give the listeners a perspective of how recent the Negro Leagues were around, are there any former Negro Leagues players who are still alive today?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A great number of them live in Birmingham, and I'm excited to see many of them, God willing, come June 20th when Major League Baseball has kind of its Field of Dreams game there at Rickwood Field, the oldest active professional baseball park in the country. And the San Francisco Giants and the St. Louis Cardinals will play a professional baseball game there, a Major League Baseball game at that historic stadium. And I just heard last week or so that Willie Mays has agreed to come. Now, we're still hopeful that his health will hold up. And this is really significant, not just because he is arguably the greatest Major League Baseball player, certainly the greatest living Major League Baseball player, hands down, but arguably the greatest Major League Baseball player of all time. But for those who may not know, Willie Mays began his career as a 17-year-old center fielder for the Birmingham Black Barons playing at Rickwood Field. So this would be monumental to have Mr. Mays walk back on that field some 75 plus years since he walked in there to be the center fielder for the Birmingham Black Barons. And only baseball can create these kinds of moments. I love all the sports. I love all the sports, but baseball has a magical way of creating these moments, man, that just gives you goosebumps. I can only imagine what that crowd, and I'm sure it's going to be a capacity crowd. The stadium only holds about 7,000 people. That's going to be one of the hottest tickets in baseball to try to get a seat. People calling me now, no, I can't hook you up. So,
Hot. It would be hot because it would be hard to get a ticket. And it's hot because it's
it's
South
going to be hot in
Alabama too.
Birmingham.
I've actually had the privilege of coaching a game at Rickwood Field. Um, our American Legion team came down from Annapolis back in 2015, I think it was,
Okay.
and we played a game there. My son was
Yeah,
our
it's a
center
special
fielder
place.
on that team.
Yeah, it's a special place, and you feel the spirits, the ghost of those legendary stars, not just those who played for the Birmingham Barons. When you start talking about the likes of Willie Mays and Sam Harrison and Piper Davis, Big Jim Zapp, Satchel Paige played for the Birmingham Black Barons, but all the legendary stars that came into town to play the Barons. And so the ghost of all those stars will come to life through this game. And when baseball was doing this game in Dyersville, Iowa, that was tremendously successful. I started having people call me asking, are they going to do the same thing for the Negro Leagues? And honestly, I wasn't sure if they would or not. But this time, baseball listened, and they are completely restoring Rickwood Fields. So, number one, that it could be ready for a major league game. And it's going to be a beautiful stadium that they're going to leave the city of Birmingham. It was already a historically beautiful stadium anyway, but the changes that they're going to make are going to be amazing. So the city of Birmingham is going to be left with an absolutely magnificent stadium to continue to grow our game along all capacities. And this is going to be a seminal moment in Negro Leagues history. This is going to be one of the biggest events to ever happen for the Negro Leagues. The world will be watching Rickwood Field for this game. The St. Louis Cardinals are slated to wear the uniforms of the St. Louis Stars, and the San Francisco Giants will, of course, wear the uniforms of the old San Francisco Sea Lions of the Negro Leagues, in a epic kind of salute to the Negro League. So I am really excited about this. I'm looking forward to it.
I'm looking forward to it too. That's going to be fun. All right, so this is the last question. Let's round third and head for home on this episode. So tell me what your favorite part about your job as the president of one of America's premier privately funded museums.
You know, I love every aspect of the work that I do. Melvin, I have been so tremendously blessed, man. I started here as a volunteer in 1993. Who knew? I certainly didn't. Now, I had no idea that it would turn into a career. And I think one of the most gratifying things that I could do either personally or professionally. So this has been a passion project for me. When I walked into what was then a little one-room office here at historic 18th and Vine, I literally walked into what will become my passion. I fell in love with this museum. I fell in love with the story. I fell in love with the amazing athletes who made this history. But again, I didn't know it would turn into a career. And so every aspect of this job I absolutely enjoy, even the challenging aspects of having to raise money, because you know that the work that you're doing is bigger than you are. And that if you do it right, you will effectively leave something that will stand the test of time. You will leave a legacy. And I think all of us who are involved with this project realizes that we have a chance to leave a legacy. But I think the favorite part of my job is getting down in the gallery, meeting our guests, telling stories. Man, I go down there all the time and I tour people through the museum. More times than not, Melvin, I never tell them who I am until after we finish the tour. And it's so funny. I had guests in here recently who were in from DC, and so I came down to meet them. Started off with three of us. By the time we got out on the field of legends, it might have been 40 of us, who had all gathered around as I'm taking them through, pointing out features of the museum, telling stories. I saw Buck O'Neill do that for years. I saw Buck do that because there are a lot of people in my role, they wouldn't do that. I couldn't imagine not doing it. And I get so much from that because number one, you learn what you're doing right. You also learn what you're doing wrong, and there's something gained from both sides of the ledger. And so, but I enjoy that immensely, man. But this job has afforded me to meet people that I never dreamt that I would ever have an opportunity to meet. I'm a kid from Crawfordville, Georgia. Man, all of 500 people. Yeah, Crawfordville, Georgia is east of Atlanta, west of Augusta. And by the time this show airs, I believe you said on the 9th,
Correct.
yeah, we will have celebrated Henry Aaron's 50th anniversary of breaking Babe Ruth's record, which is still the most significant sports milestone in my lifetime. And I get to walk my childhood idol and all time favorite baseball player, Henry Aaron, through the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. It's the first and only time, Melvin, I've ever been starstruck. And every time I was around Mr. Aaron, I was always reduced to that nearly 12-year-old kid. And I tell the story oftentimes that when he hit home run 715 in Atlanta's Fulton County Stadium, I'm at home in my mother's living room in Crawfordville, Georgia, 80 miles away. And as he's circling the bases there in Atlanta's Fulton County Stadium, I'm circling the bases in my mother's living room. So the old couch was first base. She had an old TV that was second base. She had another old couch that was third base, and her recliner was home plate. And as my childhood idol was touching them all, I'm touching them all too. And there we were face to face 25 years ago in 1999, and I'm taking him on a tour of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. We've had American presidents tour this museum. We've had first ladies of these United States tour this museum, a plethora of athletes and entertainers and other dignitaries. And I say this with no disrespect to any of them. They are not Henry Aaron in the eyes, mind, and heart of this kid from Crawfordville, Georgia.
Nice. That is the perfect way to sum up this episode. So our guest today has been Bob Kendrick, who is the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City. I highly suggest you go there, and that's definitely a place on my bucket list, so I need to get there as soon as possible. So thank you today, Mr. Kendrick, for being here.
Man, it's been my pleasure. It's always great to catch up with you. Thanks for the invitation to come back and join you.
So that's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go. That was Stories from Real Life with your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. See you then.